Good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon, sorry.
Good afternoon.
So I'd like to welcome everyone to the December meeting of the Florida Credentials Review Committee. I'm Kate, Director of the REACH Office within the Executive Office of the Governor and Chair of this committee. As you know, the Credentials Review Committee is supported by CareerSource Florida, the Governor's Workforce Policy Board. I invite Kate Clement for CareerSource Florida to please call the roll.
Good afternoon. Katie Crowfoot.
Here.
Dr. Timothy Beard. Michael Biskey.
Here.
Robert Boyd. Mary Jane
Hey.
Brecklin.
I can't
Here.
hear.
Chancellor Paul Burns.
Present.
Adam Calloway.
Present.
Kevin Carr. Dr. Christopher Constantine. Catherine Golitz.
Here.
Lloyd Gregg.
Present.
Diane Head. Chancellor Kathy Hebda. Debbie Magruder.
Here.
Chancellor Kevin O'Farrell.
Present.
Chancellor Raymond Rodriguez. James Taylor. Lindsay Volpe. Chair, at this time, we do not have a quorum.
Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started. I think we've got a little time before our first action or consent item. We can move things around. I think people will be joining as we move forward. So thank you. Okay. Yeah, and Kate, can I just ask you to maybe go through the those that are present on teams that maybe didn't say anything? I think we might be having some technical difficulties with some of them.
Yes, ma'am. I'm looking through those now. I'll let you know.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Okay, so before we get to today's agenda, it is my pleasure to congratulate committee members Bob Boyd and Kevin Carr, who were recently recognized by Florida Trend as two of the state's 500 most influential business leaders. Bob Boyd is the president and CEO of Independent Colleges and Universities of Florida, also known as ICUP, the Association of Non-Profit four-year higher education institutions chartered in Florida and with 30 schools and 170,000 students and more than 210 educational sites. Its members schools produce 100,900 jobs for Florida and have a total statewide economic impact of $15.7 billion. Kevin Carr is the Chief Executive Officer of Florida Makes, a statewide public-private partnership directed at strengthening and advancing Florida's manufacturing economy and providing high-wage, high-skill employment opportunities for Florida's manufacturing workers. Kevin has led Florida Makes since its founding in 2015. This recognition by Florida Trend is much deserved, and we are grateful for Kevin and Bob's contributions to this committee's work and these important sectors of Florida's workforce. Please join me in congratulating Bob and Kevin. I'd like to,
Congratulations.
yeah, congratulations. If Bob or Kevin want to say a few words, I'd like to open it up a little bit to them. No? Okay, cool. Well, we'll hear from you guys later, I'm sure, in discussion. So it's also my pleasure to welcome our newest member of the Credentials Review Committee, Mary Jane Brecklin. Mary Jane is Vice President of Operations at Health First, a health insurance company in Melbourne, Florida, where she is responsible for the alignment of human resource operations to achieve organizational goals, drive engagement, retention through leadership, partnership, and development. She specializes in leading health talent needs through workforce planning, staffing, and hiring talent. Mary Jane has over 20 years of health experience aligning organizational services and outcomes, achieving organizational mission, strategic, and operational plans. I'm confident Mary Jane will be a vital member of this committee in its ongoing discussion about the value of credentials and lifelong learning. So welcome to Mary Jane. Greflin. Moving on to today's agenda, all members have received today's meeting agenda packet via email last week. The agenda packet is posted on the CRC's website, and the link has been placed in the chat for your convenience. The Credential Review Committee's charter identifies ethics and transparency as critical components of the work. Many of you know we are beginning our third convening and have new members. Accordingly, we will start today's meeting with an important overview by George Levesque with the law firm Gray Robinson on the ethics and open governance obligations of our committee and its membership. After this presentation, I'll provide an update on recent appeals to the decision of the committee as it relates to the master credentials list. We have one consent item on the agenda to approve the meeting minutes for September 6th of this year. CareerSource Florida Senior Vice President for Workforce Program Development, Dan McGrew, will present today's action item in addition to the 23-24 master credentials list. At our September committee meeting, committee members brought up the need to understand emerging industries and the need of credentials that support those industries. This committee has had ongoing conversations about statewide, local, and emerging occupations in demand. Today, we have an outstanding opportunity to hear from a panel of industry stakeholders, moderated by Rachel Ludwig, Senior Director for the Future of Work at the Florida Chamber Foundation. This panel will discuss emerging demand and ways in which the CRC can address emerging occupational demand in the state of Florida. After the panel discussion, CareerSource Florida Senior Vice President Dan McGrew will present on evaluating apprenticeships for the master credentials list. CareerSource Florida Senior Program Analyst Jackie Barreros will present a summary of my master credential list applications received in September. And after these presentations, there will be the opportunity for open discussion and public comment. So some reminders before we get to our first order of business. There are opportunities for public comment after the consent item is introduced, after the presentation of the action item, and again at the end of the meeting. Those who wish to comment, please contact Aisha Pompey at IPOMPEY@CareerSourceFlorida.com. Please identify yourself by name when you are called upon so we can record you properly in the minutes of the meeting. Please unmute your microphones when speaking, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. We look forward to all committee members' engagement in today's important discussion as it represents the completion of a quarterly milestone in the important work of this committee. So let's now move on to the ethics and open government presentation. I'm pleased to welcome George Levesque. George, you're recognized.
Thank you. Once again, my name is George Levesque, and I'm here to talk to you about government in the sunshine. If we could go to the next slide, please. And the overview that we're going to do is we're going to cover the Sunshine Law and Florida's public records law and the ethics laws. And I want to set everyone's expectations to take some of the pressure off of you and a little bit off of me. There is no test or quiz at the end, and I don't expect any of you to be experts on the public records law at the end of this session. The subject is just simply too complicated to cover in about 15 minutes. But a lot of this can be intuitive if you just remember that you're conducting public business and try to anticipate what to expect. My goal is to impart your own personal Jiminy Cricket so that when you have one of these issues come up, you may not know the answer, but you know that you should ask somebody for additional guidance. The overriding idea is that public business should not be conducted in smoke-filled back rooms or outside of the view of the public. CareerSource, as a quasi-public agency, is subject to these requirements, and this Credentials Review Committee is also subject to these requirements. Next slide. There are 4 basic requirements that one needs to observe when complying with Florida's open meetings law. The first one is that meetings of public boards and commissions like this Credentials Review Committee must be open to the public. Reasonable notice of such meetings must be given. Minutes of the meetings must be taken, and the public must be given reasonable opportunity to be heard on a proposition that comes before the board. Next slide, please. A meeting is defined broadly to include any formal or informal gathering of 2 or more members to discuss some matter which will foreseeably come before that board or committee for action. And this can take any form. It might involve two members meeting at a coffee shop. It might involve two members texting by phone. It could be an old-fashioned conference call, or it could be a Zoom meeting like this. Any type of meeting where two members will be exchanging information about matters coming before the board would be a meeting that needs to be noticed and open to the public. Next slide, please. What does it mean to be open to the public? This is an area where sort of common sense kicks in. It needs to be reasonably open to the public. So for example, if you're holding a meeting and you're anticipating that 200 people are going to be showing up, you don't want to establish the venue for the meeting as a broom closet that can't accommodate the public. Another feature is that board members, and you see this often in the legislature, and the legislature has some unique features to their open meeting laws, but as it applies to the executive branch and committees like this one, I would discourage you from having off-the-record conversations outside of the view of the public. That can be problematic and can raise issues that might embroil you in a legal challenge. The other aspect is that the public has a right to be heard at deliberations where decisions affecting the public are going to be made. Next slide, please. The important thing to remember is that when there are violations of the open meetings laws, there are consequences. The first action that could be, or the first consequence is that any action taken at that meeting may be voided by a court of competent jurisdiction. Other actions, if there's a knowing violation of the open meetings law, criminal penalties may apply. The governor may remove you from office. There may be civil penalties that apply where there is a non-criminal infraction. And then, of course, there's the ability to have attorney's fees awarded against your agency for violations of the law. And one point that I would probably also include on there, and this will go for all of the penalties that we talk about that may apply to any violations, whether it's the Sunshine Law, the Public Records Law, or the Ethics Law. There's the damage to one's reputation. A lot of times when these things happen, there may not be a criminal penalty, there may not be a civil penalty, but you have your name dragged through the mud in the press. And to the extent that you subscribe to the idea that all press is good press, I would counsel you otherwise. But it is a better way to kind of stay out of the press or only have your name mentioned with good things. Next slide. The next issue that I would like to discuss is public records. Florida has a very broad access to public records. Next slide. The root of this is rooted in Florida's Constitution. It's something that courts take very seriously. It's a constitutional right of anyone to have access to public records that are not otherwise made exempt or confidential. Next slide. Now, what makes a public record a public record? A public record is any record that is made or received by an agency in connection with official business, which is used to perpetuate, communicate, or formalize knowledge. An example would be an email from staff addressing committee-related issues. That would obviously be a public record. Something that would not be a public record are your personal notes that you're taking for your own personal benefit. You're not intending them to inform anybody else of what's going on. They're just done for your own personal benefit so that you can reference later. Those are not going to be public records unless you find yourself in a situation where you've taken notes and you share them with someone else. Once you share them with someone else, at that point, they become a public record. Next slide, please. Another important thing to remember is public records can take any form. It can be in an email. It can be in an actual written letter. The test is whether the record was created or received in connection with public business, not how it was created. But it's important to remember, if it's not related to public business, it's not going to be a public record. For example, you may email your spouse or significant other that you're going to be late, but we'll pick up some hot wings or something like that from Publix on the way home. That's probably not a public record related to public business, but theoretically it could be, because if your agency has a policy of not using your work email for personal use, that could be a violation of your agency's policy. And if there's disciplinary action against you, that might lead into it theoretically becoming a public record. So again, it's one of those things where you really need to look at the entire context for how a record was created, why it was created, and what the significance of that record is. Just be aware that when you're creating records, particularly email, particularly text, particularly any type of digital communication, that when you send it, it goes out into the world, you lose control of that. So while it may be a transient communication that you delete, keep in mind that whoever you sent it to may still have it. So more often than not, when people get caught up in problems with public records, it's an issue where they've created a record that they've sent to somebody else. They may have deleted it, or maybe they didn't delete it, and then somebody comes in and asks for those records, and then you've got a record of that communication. And sometimes people in text or emails may be a little intemperate. They may not phrase things as carefully as they would if they'd been thinking that this is something that's going to create a permanent record. So just please be very careful to keep that in mind. One thing that I advise people to do is don't put anything in writing, whether it's text, email, or otherwise, that you would be embarrassed about having your mom read in the newspaper. Next slide, please. And I believe I covered this one as well. Next slide, please. There are certainly consequences for violating the, I'm sorry, if we can go back one slide. Okay. Nope, I think I'm missing a slide, but we'll go to the next slide that deals with penalties. There are consequences for violating the public records law. Non-criminal infractions are published by up to a $500 fine. There's suspension, removal, or impeachment from office. Knowing and willful violations are first-degree misdemeanors. And then, of course, award of attorney's fees. Usually, when there's a violation of the public records law, these tend to end up in the press. So there's reputational damage that can attach to that as well. Next slide. And the next area that I'd like to talk about is the ethics laws, how you should conduct yourself as a member of this committee. Generally, there are going to be two types of provisions. There's going to be provisions that require you to abstain from doing certain things, and then there is going to be provisions that require disclosure. These are all delineated in Chapter 112.313 and the subsequent statutes. Next slide, please. It's applicable to public officers. Public officers would be broad enough to include the members of this committee, even to the extent that a lot of what they do are provide advisory recommendations. Even in that capacity, the restrictions would still apply. And next slide, please. As a prefatory matter, or the first order of business, there are certain things that you should never do. You should never solicit or accept gifts from people who are not your family members. Family members are defined broadly to include your immediate family members, your grandparents, your aunts, uncles, and cousins and nieces, as well as those that would be in the in-law capacity. One thing that should never happen, even with your family members, is you should never solicit or accept a gift that is requested with the intent or understanding that it would be influencing one of the votes that you will take as a part of this committee. You should also not solicit anything over $100 from anyone who is not a family member. You can still ask grandma for something over that amount, as long as it's not done with the intent to influence your action on this committee. If somebody does provide something to you under the law, you would be obligated to report that if it's over $100. The wrinkle there is the governor, through executive order, has established that there's a zero tolerance policy. And so while you can't solicit or accept, I would encourage you to adopt the governor's executive order, as that would govern the governor's decision making and the agency's decision making regarding your service on that committee. In certain circumstances, there's prohibited employment. I've not gone through each of your backgrounds, because there is some nexus in terms of the way this committee operates. If there is a concern with that, please reach out to the CareerSource staff or Katie Crowfoot, and we can look at that as a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, the idea behind prohibited employment is you can't be employed as part of an entity that your organization regulates. Again, unauthorized compensation. Generally, this is the anti-nepotism policy. If you believe that you are finding yourself in a situation where that may apply, I would encourage you to reach out to someone, and we can look at that on a case-by-case basis. And then finally, the misuse of public position or disclosure or use of private information, to the extent that you find yourself in a position where one of the classic examples that would violate this is if you're using your position to threaten someone to do something else. There are also other kind of criminal penalties that might be, or criminal descriptions that might apply to that. But one should just be very mindful of how one wields the authority that is vested in this committee. Next slide. In certain circumstances, you may find yourself in a situation where you may have a voting conflict. Again, this is one where I would encourage you to reach out. The analysis for a lot of these different areas may depend on very minute facts that make it either a conflict or not. But generally speaking, a conflict is anything that is going to create a special private gain or loss to you, your principal employer, a business associate, if you find yourself in a private business where there's a partnership or some other type of arrangement, or relatives. Keep in mind that relative in this context is going to be narrower, and it only includes one's immediate family and in-laws, going up to the father and down to the children. Next slide, please. And again, there are, with these violations, there are criminal penalties that may apply. There are civil penalties that may apply. There's always reputational damage when you find yourself on the other side of Florida's ethics laws, and there may be removal from office. With that, I will wrap up my presentation. If anyone has any questions, please feel reach out to me by email or phone, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can direct them through Christine Day there at the information on the screen.
Thank you, George. Do any of the members of the committee have any questions? Well, thank you for joining us today, George. We really appreciate your thorough review of the Sunshine Law.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a little change of scenery. I heard the audio wasn't so great in the other room, so hope you all can hear better now. So as you all know, the Credentials Review Committee receives applications for quarterly review and approval of credential applications. The Master Credentialist also serves as the basis for the Florida Department of Education's Career and Professional Education Act, or CAPE Industry Certification Funding List. Applicants seeking eligibility for CAPE Act funding for secondary and or post-secondary industry certifications must submit a Master Credentials List application. The submission must meet both CAPE eligibility criteria as set forth in 6A 6.0576 Florida Administrative Code and Florida Administrative Register, and standards defined in the framework of quality. Certifications that are added to the 23-24 Master Credential List are also added to the 24-25 CAPE Industry Certification Funding List. Our committee charter established procedures for applicants to appeal the decisions of the committee, which are summarized here. I think we have a slide. I think we've got one, it's the next slide. Our committee charter, so to date, 2 appeals have been received for a total of 8 separate credentials. The credentials that were appealed and the reason for the appeal are listed here. So are there any questions from the committee members about the appeals process or any of the appeals that you see on your screen? Okay, hearing none, we will move on now to today's only consent item. And just to put on the record, a quorum is present. We do have enough members, so a quorum is present. So if you have in your agenda packet a copy of the minutes from the Credentials Review Committee September 6th, 2023 meeting. All members of the committee, having had an opportunity to review the minutes beforehand, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Mike Biskey moves to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Kevin O'Farrell, second.
Okay, I heard Kevin O'Farrell first. So Kevin O'Farrell seconds. Is there any discussion of the meeting minutes? Are there any comments or questions from the public on the consent item? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. The consent agenda passes. Thank you. So moving on to our action item, the REACH Act established the CRC to identify non-degree and degree credentials for value for inclusion in the Master Credential List. Such credentials must include registered apprenticeship programs, industry certifications, licenses, advanced technical certificates, college credit certificates, career certificates, applied technology diplomas, Associates of Science and Associates of Applied Science degrees, and Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Applied Science degrees. It is my pleasure to recognize CareerSource Florida Senior Vice President Dan McGrew to present the first action item.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. Today, we are presenting a handful of credentials that we are recommending for addition to the state's Master Credentials List. Before we get into the credentials to add, I just want to remind the committee that as notified back in September, the September deadline for credential applications were going to be considered at our February meeting. So the credentials that we're considering today are not credentials for which we received applications. Rather, these credentials represent 2 distinct buckets of credentials that were evaluated. First, the one group of credentials that we're going to consider today is a group of credentials from the original credential inventory that was in place when we first applied the framework of quality back in February of this year. These credentials were not able to be fully evaluated at the time and required additional evaluation. So we're going to show you the results of that evaluation today. And we committed to completing a full evaluation of that existing inventory. So the credentials in this bucket, as I said, just required a little bit more time. The second bucket of credentials are new credentials that are newly offered in our public post-secondary system as of the 2023-2024 school year. And we made a commitment again early on for new programs that are added at our Florida college system and district post-secondary system we would automatically evaluate those credentials and not subject them to having to apply, right? So we'll do that on an annual basis. If you'll advance the slide for me, Nathan. All of the credentials that were evaluated using the framework of quality that was approved at the last Credentials Review Committee meeting, which as a reminder, just updated the labor market data to the most recently available data. So you can see here, we evaluated 1 new degree credential, 8 new non-degree credentials, 1 existing degree credential, and 31 existing non-degree credential. So please note that while the evaluation for the credentials was conducted the same as we would for any new application, the final disposition and recommendation for inclusion on the master credentials list does differ depending upon whether the credential was new or already existing. So again, the summary of the results of the evaluation presented here. And regarding the recommendation before you today, as I said, the recommendation is going to differ based on whether this was new or existing. Nathan, if you'll advance the slide, 1 slide. So for new credentials, so these are new programs of study that are being offered in either our Florida college system or district post-secondary schools. These credentials, if they pass the framework of quality, the recommendation is that we will add them to the master credentials list. If they did not pass the framework of quality, the recommendation is that these do not get added to the master credentials list. And this is exactly how we would, this is consistent rather with how we evaluate new applications that are received. If they pass, we recommend them to you for addition. And if they don't pass, then they are sent a denial letter. For the existing credentials, next slide, however, following the precedent that we made with the original evaluation of the existing credential inventory at the time, if it passes the framework of quality, recommendation is to add to the master credentials list with full approval. And for those credentials that do not pass the framework of quality, either for wage or for demand, the recommendation is that we add them to the master credentials list on provisional status. So those of you who have been in these meetings for the year, we know that we have a number of credentials that are on the master credentials list that we've granted provisional status, meaning they're on, but we've notified that either they need to meet local demand or sequencing or both, depending upon whether or not that credential did not pass the demand criteria or the wage threshold criteria. And again, this is consistent with how we evaluated the original credentials inventory. And these credentials were existing on that inventory. They just required more time in order to complete the full evaluation. As a final reminder, credentials that are placed on provisional status for the 2024-2025 master credentials list that will be considered at our February meeting will have 1 year to cure their deficiency before being removed from the list. So the first time credentials would be removed from the list if they were on provisional status would be July 1, 2026. Okay. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you. And actually the recommendation, in summary, next slide. So the results of the evaluation to approve the addition of 18 credentials of value to the 23-24 master credentials list with full approval and 14 additional credentials with provisional approval, and then send those recommendations to the CareerSource Florida Board of Directors for delivery. And as usual, approve any technical revisions to the list that need to be made by the Department of Education as needed without adding or removing credentials not explicitly described in this action item. And the list of those credentials are included in your packet today. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to present the action item.
Thanks, Dan. Are there any questions for Dan on the action item? Is there a motion to approve the action item?
James Taylor, so moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
I heard Lloyd Greggs, second. Any discussion? Are there any comments or questions from the public?
There are no comments, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So all those in favor, say aye.
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 Those opposed, no. The motion passes. Thank you guys, and thank you to the team that worked so hard on evaluating those credentials and bringing that recommendation forward to the committee. So now on to our next agenda item. As indicated earlier, the committee now has a unique opportunity to hear from industry stakeholders, including committee member James Taylor, on the importance of addressing emerging occupational demand throughout the state. I'd like to welcome Daryl McCall, Senior Director with CareerSource Florida's Workforce Program Strategies team, to introduce today's panel discussion. Daryl, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, committee. I'd like to start off by saying that the committee has done an amazing job in establishing the master credentials list by developing a strong framework of quality and putting into place good processes and mechanisms to vet all of the credentials that we know about. And so what we have is a clear picture of what demand is and what wages are associated with that demand. But as Chair Crowfoot mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, at our last Credentials Review Committee, we were charged with exploring credentials that are missing from the master credentials list, and especially what emerging credentials may need to be identified and included on the list. So we've asked Florida Commerce to conduct an analysis of how many occupations currently on the demand occupation list do not have a corresponding credential on the master credential list. And the initial analysis of that shows that there are 21, or 16.9% of the individual demand occupations that do not have a credential associated with it. We also reached out to our partners in the critical industries of semiconductor manufacturing, telecommunications, broadband, aviation, aerospace, and information technology to get an industry perspective on what may be missing from the master credential list. And these industries are fast moving, and it's not uncommon for their workforce needs to outpace the education pipelines that are currently in place. So today we have a real treat. Today you'll hear directly from a panel of leaders in these industries. These leaders are actively participating in developing solutions to talent gaps in these emerging occupations and are helping to identify credentials needed now and in the future. And we will gain their unique perspectives on the importance of this list and how it can help develop clear talent pipelines impacting hiring, upskilling, and retention, further supporting Florida's businesses and economic development opportunities in Florida. The ultimate goal here is to inform our work to ensure that the master credential list is both responsive to the needs of businesses in our state. We're fortunate to have our partners from the Florida Chamber Foundation here today as well. As you recall, CareerSource Florida partnered with the Chamber Foundation on their Workforce Needs Study 2.0 efforts earlier this year, seeking to share businesses, the existence and the importance of the master credential list and gain critical feedback from industry on their credential needs, challenges, and their preferred method of sharing this intelligence ahead of traditional data methods. The report from this study is slated to be released soon, and once that's released, we're going to be inviting the Chamber Foundation back to the committee to share these results. We appreciate the partnership of the Florida Chamber Foundation and their efforts to help resolve Florida's talent supply concerns. So now I'd like to introduce our partner and moderator for this exciting discussion, Rachel Ludwig. She's the Senior Director of Future of Work for the Florida Chamber Foundation. She leads the foundation's initiatives to improve Florida's talent pipeline, which is a critical component of the Florida's 2030 blueprint in our pursuit to become the 10th largest global economy by 2030. The Future of Work Florida initiative focuses on cultivating partnerships among the business community, workforce, and education partners to develop talent pipeline strategies for early learning through lifelong learning. Before transitioning to the Florida Chamber, Rachel worked at the Florida Department of Education, Division of Career and Technical Education, where she oversaw statewide professional development for adult education. Through this work, she was able to collaborate with education leaders and key stakeholders to increase her knowledge of various industry and workforce needs throughout Florida. And she led expansion efforts of integrated education and training programs, which accelerate the ability for adult learners to enter the workforce. Rachel has worked in K-12 post-secondary and workforce education to serve learners across urban, suburban, and rural spaces. She spent much of her career teaching adult GED and English language learners. And now we'll turn it over to Rachel to introduce our industry panel and get this discussion started. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Daryl. I'm really excited to be here. As Daryl mentioned, I think this conversation is super critical as we think about our 2030 blueprint and working to diversify Florida's economy, especially including industries that will be represented on our panel today. And also thinking about how we are going to consider, these fast-moving industries when we talk about our master credentials list. So I have the privilege to introduce our panelists today. As you can see on the screen, we have Dr. David Arnold. He's a professor and associate chair of electrical and computer engineering. He's actually the associate chair for faculty affairs in that department at the University of Florida. We also have Jesus Labena, who is the senior vice president, corporate operations for MasTech Communications Group, and Mike Miller. He is the VP of External Affairs for Workforce Integration at Space Florida, as well as James Taylor, the CEO of Florida Technology Council, who is also on the Credential Review Committee that you all are on. So I'm excited to start this off today, and just want to pose the first question to really all the panelists. To kind of get your perspective on, what occupations do you see as emerging that will need credentials developed that maybe don't already exist there? So go ahead and kick it off. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Arnold first.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, and to the distinguished members of the board. It's a great opportunity to be with you. Certainly, there's a lot of acceleration in the high-tech space. My expertise is specifically in the area of semiconductors, and there's a huge national effort for re-onshoring of chips. But there's also a lot of future growth expected in AI and autonomous systems, as well as, I think, potential explosive growth in the space industry to see more commercial launch systems and space assets being able to help us here down on the ground live and improve our society in many different ways that right now we don't even fully foresee.
Thank you. Jesus, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon to the committee. We are at a point of high demand for broadband construction resources across the country. We at the MasTech Communications Group, we're estimating that over 200,000 workers will be required through 2026 to support the country's high-speed internet deployment plan. So we're at a significant point of shortage here where we really need to focus on workforce development to tackle this deployment and make sure that we bring high-speed internet to rural communities across the country.
Thank you. Mike, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, again, I echo the comments of the previous two speakers that it's exciting to be a part of this conversation, exciting to be able to talk about not only all the good work that the Reach Office and CareerSource is doing, but just what does the next generation look like? And, obviously I'm working in what I think was probably one of the coolest sectors in the aerospace industry. And I'm looking, as we're talking, I'm looking on my computer screen about all the current positions that are available across the aerospace sector. But really, I think the biggest thing to think about from the credentialing list is, how do we marry that next generation with we got robots and AI and all these next generation types technologies that are going to be working in the space industry? How do we teach young people to interact with those and how to use the technology in the most advantageous way? I think especially with robots and how we're going to be using them to construct things maybe even on orbit or on the moon or another planet. I think those are interesting topics to start talking about. How do you credential and get young people interested in that concept of working with a robot or working with the next generation of technology, so that when we are building the next generation of spacecraft or we're living in another part of the universe, we can use those technologies in the most effective way.
Thank you. And James, you want to comment on this part?
You bet. That's the nice thing about going last is they give all the answers first.
But truly, when you talk about emerging technologies, we do see, 6G technology, autonomous vehicles. Clearly, that's starting to really take a lead. Nanotechnology, edge computing. There's so many different areas. But in reality, with technology, looking at that, there's so many things that exist already, and the emerging part are components of what's already existing. Internet of Things, for example. How long have we been talking about that? But the expansion of connected devices in our homes and in our work, and there's so many new areas that we're venturing into that as soon as we, expand down those roads with AI, with machine learning, and multiply what we're doing, we've opened up tremendous amount of new jobs and new education requirements.
Yeah, if I could, Rachel, sorry, because James just brought up a really good point, and I'm glad he's on this board because I've been learning a lot from him through the last year or two. The idea of that advanced air mobility, that's really, if you had to pin it down to one thing in our sector right now, is there's a lot of conversation going on, and just in Orlando yesterday and today, I believe, or Monday and yesterday, they're talking about how to handle all that, how to handle air taxis, and how to handle the eventually will be autonomous. That's an amazing emerging sector that I think Florida, of all the states, Florida has a really good opportunity to take the lead on, and that will take a lot of a new look at how we handle aviation in terms of the advanced air mobility. So that's an interesting sector for us to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Did you want to say something, Dr. Arnold? Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everybody. The downfall of going first is you don't get to hear the other answers. So I think the common thread that I think is important to take a step back. So I'm a professor in engineering, and if you think about our world is most definitely dominated by technology solutions at this point. And what we've observed as humans is that the pace of technology just continues to accelerate. That's the faster adoption. And so I worry about the ability, the topic or the question was related to the emerging technologies or emerging occupations and need for additional new credentials. Daryl used the term outpaces in his opening remarks. And I think that's the fundamental challenge, is that some of the explosive growth that can happen literally almost overnight with a new software platform or a new technology just goes so much faster than it takes for our school systems to be responsive, legislation to be passed, funds to be dispersed. And so I think we're just going to find this problem recurring no matter what the actual technical field is, just as a general comment.
Rachel, can we roll on this for just a minute?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Point. And Dr. Arnold, the part that's terrifying for your end is the one that's just incredibly exciting, our end in industry. But Mike hit on one of those things when we're talking about even personal travel, air travel. Well, we're not talking just about jobs that are developing that. We're talking about all components of that, from manufacturing all the way through to trainings for how to utilize these. So to me, maybe that is the scary part, is when we introduce one thing, we're actually introducing 15 to 20 different things. And then we're also positioning Florida to build around that. So when you think about IBM when they first started, and then the supportive businesses that build all around them in the area, and that is something that does happen over and over again. SpaceX has been a great example as well. So this little teeny problem right now is going to be amplified greatly just over the next few years.
Yeah, and I can kind of speak to, when I was at the department, and you sort of have to balance having a system in place to vet all the opportunities and all the potential industry certifications that exist. And so I would love to hear your thoughts, and this committee will be involved in this, of like, what is your recommendation for sort of an approach to account for these fast moving industries, but also have something in place that you can vet the quality certifications that we want to prioritize here in this state to move our economy forward.
We can look at Mike for part of that, because he's done this to a degree with Space Florida. The first thing that he did was reach out to industry leaders across the entire state to bring them in and give them a voice. So it's just completely impossible to expect the Department of Education, as vast as it is, to handle something like this. It is going to require that private sector and private-public partnerships.
And the trust. I think one of the things, thank you, James. I think the trust is also, when we first started doing those convenings, and we all know on this call, Karen Hoffman, who's been a big help to me here at Space Florida, we put together a group of industry leaders and also some of the the local education folks all through the spectrum. And there was a lot of trust that had to be built up in terms of communicating, the business side was, what not only do what we need, but if we do tell other folks what we need, is that going to somehow be a proprietary exposure moment? And that was a great learning point for me in particular, and I think a lot for the education providers too, that we need to really communicate, trust each other, that industry is going to tell us which way to go, and then we've got to adapt accordingly. And I think that's one of the great pieces about the REACH Act, is it's giving this adaptability. And then when Senate Bill 240 came out, it was listening to some of that conversation and trying to articulate it into legislation. So I mean, David was right earlier too. You got to be careful about when you get into all these things. The government lags, and you have to figure out that process and make sure that it doesn't become a hindrance. So that when the education realm and the industry are communicating clearly, that process isn't bogged down by some other bureaucracy in the middle. But I do think to finish that thought, that there are a lot of opportunities for industry to stay engaged, and that's one of the reasons that I think this whole concept of doing the master credentials list, it's been sort of a Johnny come lately moment for a lot of the industry folks. They're like, wait, there's a list we can get on and we can act, and now that you guys are having these quarterly updates to add credentials to it, I think that's going to give us even a better ability to have that trust engagement, and then build on these successes. So that's been my experience, that if you just get the industry to engage and you keep them engaged, there's going to be a lot of buy-in.
Yeah, Rachel, if I may, I think that's a key point, right? I think getting industry engaged earlier on, it'll make sure that the requirements that the industry needs are being met and addressed, right? And I think the industry folks are probably, have a very direct tie into what's happening across marketplaces, and know exactly what the demand is for these skill sets. So I think it's a very good collaboration.
And Rachel, one of the things that we're looking at, and I have the distinct pleasure of working directly with industry and then working directly with state government, and some of that is watching, in the past years, state government going, well, industry doesn't tell us, and industry going, well, you don't do what we tell you. And really, what that comes down to is what we're talking about for these credentials is education. So industry can have an absolutely wonderful idea. Industry has that ability, however, to test ideas. If it fails, that's a win, because they learned something from that. State have that luxury. So how do we train and teach industry how to introduce those ideas correctly? Because some of those things that we think, well, this is a no-brainer. Well, no, that's just not the case. When you get in and you learn the processes, and this is where working with CareerSource has just been phenomenal. It was like a crash course in education on how do you introduce things, how do you then implement what's needed that has to go along with this. Because there's a misunderstanding that I am, great company X, and I'm just, I guess that is a company now. So I am great company W, and I just give you my certification, and you should teach that. But that whole part of it needs to be tied into, the credentials. It has to be part of CAPE funding, or education institutions aren't going to fund that. There's education that has to happen on both sides. And that may be one of the biggest areas that we need to address, is not just asking industry what should we be teaching, but first positioning industry to learn, how do we do this? What's the reality of this? What is that process? So now when I say, here's something you should do, well, it's actually achievable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? I just got to jump in again, because I do think that, in my previous experience working over at Florida Virtual School, this goes back, and I remember talking to their curriculum development teams, 10 years ago about, wanting to get into CTEs and wanting to get into, some of that stuff. And they built a lot of courses and they spent a lot of money, and then there was no awareness of those courses, or the school districts just didn't have there was just a myriad of circumstances and so they sat fallow. And then when we came back around a few years later to say, hey, this is a lot of great opportunity to develop even a next generation of CTE courses, there was a lot of hesitancy. because there wasn't awareness. There wasn't the whole. It takes a whole. It's an education package on all sides, is what I'm trying to say. And I think we've done it's been a wonderful experience for me the last couple of years to see that maturation process, that everybody's starting to become aware of what's out there. The CAPE list is a great example of now there's a reward to engaging again. So I do think that's what James is saying. I think it's an awareness, because education doesn't get a chance to try and fail a lot. You spend a lot of money building out curriculum, and then if it isn't useful, then that's a struggle. So I think you got to get it right the first time. And so that's the communication leading up to the actual what we just went through, and having the credentials filed and then reviewed is how do we get that done in a timely manner that also gets more success than failure.
Yeah, so I would love to, since you have the ears of the committee members here on this call, in thinking about each of your industries and what your focus areas are, are there specific credentials that are not on the master credential list currently that maybe should be, given your knowledge of what careers are going to be growing or are continuing to grow? Is there anything that stood out to you when you took a look at that list and you're like, oh, for my industry, I need this on there?
Yeah, Rachel, I can probably start with that, and I can tell you guys, we deploy these broadband networks. We're going to need aerial linemen, fiber installers, right, to deploy high-speed internet. We're going to need drill operators, right? Drilling and trenching are going to be some of the skills that are needed to deploy fiber cable underground, right? We're going to need splicers, both on the fiber side and on the coax side. That's going to be key as we connect all these networks together to what's existing there. So these are the skills that we need in the occupations and the credentials that we need going forward to be able to deploy networks across the country.
And I can speak on the semiconductor and chip side. Searching through the list, there's not specific credentials or programs that are, maybe have semiconductor in the title, but there's a tremendous amount of adjacent fields, and certainly semiconductor manufacturing is a subset of advanced manufacturing. And so there's definitely opportunity to create new credentials that might be custom fit to some of the needs of the regional semiconductor manufacturers. Interestingly, though, even nationwide, because the semiconductor industry is something that, manufacturing side, at least the United States had sort of walked away from in past decades, and now is, with a lot of, federal investment trying to relaunch and with a lot of excitement around the globe, there's opportunity to create new credentialing entities. And so there's a big question in the semiconductor space of who should be the keeper of those credentials, and how are those even offered before they even get on the master credential list. We have to have somebody offering the credential somewhere.
Rachel, may I actually speak in support of the good Dr. Arnold? My name is Chris Constantine. I'm also a semiconductor guy. I've been in this industry for 3 decades at this point, and we make equipment typically at the high level for semiconductor processing. To reiterate what David was saying, and I've looked very closely. I take that back. There is a single national credential for semiconductor technicians. And this is very, very new. It's something that came out of the Maricopa County Community College, strictly at the behest of both Intel and TSMC, who are building these gigantic, multi-billion-dollar fabs there, and needed something on the level of 2,000 to 3,000 technicians each in order to bring this from a greenfield to an actual wafer fabrication plant. So these fabs are clearly going up, or trying to, in America, to reshore some of the technologies that frankly we have just given away. However, the point is that I just finished teaching a class at Valencia College in semiconductor technician and digital robotics. And the idea is that frankly, neither of those two industries actually have real credentialing. So we had to make do and try and see whether there were things that these students could come out with at the end of the day that actually gave them something that you could transport and have as a transparent understanding of what you've just learned. And I think these are the keys. This has to be the goal of not just this committee, but frankly, moving forward to the idea of education at the sub-baccalaureate level. I mean, these are directed based education, and so from the semiconductor side, I mean, quite honestly, I just want to quickly say that it's the only credential available is effectively a boot camp 2-week class that the college in Phoenix area has put together strictly for the Intel group, and it's actually quite interesting. I tried very hard to get that credential actually certified through Valencia College for the students that I just ended up teaching, and the inertia is difficult, but perhaps that's something that this committee could also take a look at. I'm sorry, I yield.
Right, too. The semiconductor is clearly a space there, but we're going to find that same thing rolling into healthcare industry as well. Just the changes that are happening there, expansion on data analysts, certifications that are needed and required, medical information specialists, virtual health coaches are now a real thing that's happening. So, and then we could roll into green jobs as well. So, agriculture, there's certifications there. And in fact, the agriculture industry was kind enough to come to our committee a few times and say, we want to make sure we're involved and be able to have input on this. That's changing because now you're talking about sustainable jobs within agriculture. So I think the interesting part for me is we can look at all of these different jobs now and realize that all of that is expanding, and we are going to need new credentials and certifications in almost every one of these sectors.
I only have one quick thing to add because this was a good discussion on specifics, but if you backed it up just a little bit, and actually I hear this every time I go to any industry out on the Cape or anywhere around the country to talk about aerospace, and I don't want to use the term because it's a tough one, to say the word soft skills. It's really employability skills. And I don't know if there's a credential or a certificate or something, or maybe it's just encouraging them to be embedded in some of these other credentials. But that is a key, and maybe it's just life, but I feel like if we reward young people for, having the wherewithal to have a better understanding of how to keep a calendar and do some of the things that make you a responsible employee, that would be something that if we could put that on somebody's resume, that they've done something at that level, where they just understand the basics of functioning as an employer or employable person. I'd love to explore that further. I'd love to have some of the industry folks come in and say, what are some of those skills that are needed to be more employable? Because I think those are missing, and it might be a societal question. It might be something we could do with credentials, but I just thought I'd bring it up.
Yeah, Mike, I have to chime in because I talk to businesses every day, and everybody, no matter what industry they're from, are talking about that as well. And the importance of employability skills. That was actually going to be my last question, is sort of like, where do you prioritize that? Something cross-sector like employability skills and digital literacy, for that matter, in this process of vetting credentials for the master credentialist. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that before we kind of wrap up our conversation and invite questions from the public.
I'll just finish the thought by saying, yeah, employability skills. I think we've got to get there. We've got to figure out how that could be, qualified and quantified in a credential. And one of the things that we're working on here at Space Florida is also bringing in, the idea of a space academy into some of these school districts, where we're actually trying to work with kids even in middle school age and high school age. And we are going to be working with the school districts on things that are directly applicable to aerospace and related industries. And then we're going to do our best to embed some of these employability skills into those conversations. So I think space academies will be a part of that. But I think that again, sounds like I was preaching to the choir with you, Rachel.
I'm a big supporter of Space Academy. It's just a brilliant idea. It's also tempting to look at this we're looking at from Department of Education, We're looking at it from industry. But the reality is, if industry wanted to, they could create their own education and just do all their certifications, accreditations themselves and go forward. It's much more feasible to use the strength of the Department of Education, who has the processes in place to do that and work together. But truthfully, it's neither one of these. It's the people that are looking for those jobs and wanting, should I upskill? Should I, go into a new sector? If we don't start with people, then we won't get there for a process, a successful process. And if we're looking at the people, then we're looking at items like, how do we make this accessible so they can do this in the shortest time, easiest time, most financially beneficial time possible? And that is one thing that I've been happy that our committee as a whole has been looking at and addressing too. If we can start there, then we certainly can look at ways that all of us can add to that.
All right. Well, is there any other comment from our panelists before we open it up to the audience for questions? I think I saw Kevin Carr. Your hands up?
Yeah. Kevin, I believe you're on mute.
Kevin was going to give us another hour, Rachel, that we could just keep talking.
I hope he was going to plug the new chip manufacturing registered apprenticeship that was launched in Florida. Maybe that was where he was going.
That wasn't where he's going.
Uh-oh, something's up with his microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's talking. Yeah.
Okay. We're not able to hear. I'm not able to hear Kevin. Are you all able to hear him?
No.
So, Kevin, we're going to try to come back to you once your audio is figured out. Is there anyone else who has any questions from the panel or the public?
The question the public should be asking is, how can we contribute? How can we support this? How can we participate? So maybe that would be one that we can look at.
Yeah.
I think another big topic is, supply of workforce, talent. And so Florida is a very populous state. Arguably we should have enough people to fill jobs of high wage, high need, high demand jobs. But I feel that we maybe need a little more focus on inspiring the younger generation to pursue some of these, perceived to be harder technology tracks, especially in the fields related to anything STEM. There's definitely many ways off ramps where students, lose interest or lose their confidence that they could succeed in fields like this. So whether that's, starting down in the early, elementary, middle school, exposing them to ideas, which there's lots of things that are being done, robotics and other outreach programs, but also for incumbent workers. So people who may be in sort of a trades field that can be upskilled. I was giving an example on a call earlier with Eastern Florida State College about, maybe there's pool technicians. They drive around all day, 30-year-old guy that's been repairing pool pumps, taking care of, residential maintenance. It's not a big step for that person to get a little bit of incumbent worker training, to upskill, to have the knowledge to be effective and work in a semiconductor manufacturing plant, repairing lots of pumps that push fluids and gases around throughout a system like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think a lot of it's just not a lack of awareness by our young people, by our parents, by people who are going to work every day, just trying to, eke out a living. So I think some sort of marketing campaign and really championing the opportunities that Florida offers to its residents is something that I think we could do a lot better in.
Yeah, just to follow up on Dr. Arnold's point, I just want to agree, right? It's not only important to expose, students and folks that are in high school and middle school to these new positions that are in high demand and new skills, but also show them a career path, right? This is we're exposing you to this, but this is where we could lead you to. We could eventually lead you to becoming a project manager, a construction manager, a field director. I mean, there's definitely growth opportunities here that the industry can offer, and I think I think it's important that we show that full picture, Some folks, again, some folks that are not meant to go to college, right? It's not really their thing, right? But these are important positions that can give them a very good wage, and they can grow professionally.
And some of that is not complicated. We can look at things. One of the things that was my absolute favorite takeaway from working with the advisory board with Space Florida as we were going through this was going back to early education when we have second and third graders that have to go to their math class, and it was math. But yet change that to space math, and suddenly it's engaging and it's exciting. And if you can not only do that, but draw that correlation, learning these items brings you here. And then in education, do a better job of showing what's that end game. Because the end game so far has been portrayed as earn an education to this point, and then earn it to this point, and then earn it to this point. But if we can relate that into real world, what does it mean when you do these items? That starts doing exactly what we were talking about before that. How do we engage that younger group to be part of this?
Yes, it is definitely all about delivery as someone who was in the classroom for a number of years, and how you frame what that delivery looks like. So I will turn it back over to Daryl or Madam Chair. I'm not sure who's taking over next, but thank you all so much for being a part of this panel. I learned a lot just from this time we've had together. I hope the committee has too.
Thank you. Great opportunity.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, committee. Thank you, panel members. Outstanding job. A lot of great points and topics. So I'll turn it back over to Madam Chair and see if she has any additional follow-up questions or where she wants to take it next. Thank you all. Madam Chair.
Got it. Muted. I said some really smart things then, so I hope I can repeat myself. So thank you. Thank you, Daryl and Rachel and the panelists. We really appreciate y'all's time today and your insights. As y'all discussed, the emerging industries is definitely a point that this committee wants to focus on in the future. And I think with the input from this panel, we've got some great next steps that staff can be looking towards. So I think really what we need to be doing next is kind of continue talking with industry and our partners about how to create a little bit more of a formalized process for ensuring that these emerging industries and credentials have a path forward to make it onto the master credential list. And I'm sure that will include partnerships with organizations that already are involved in the CRC, but maybe some that aren't. So thank you guys so much for your time today, and I look forward to continuing these discussions in upcoming committee meetings.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, we're going to move on to our next item. I'd like to invite Dan McGrew to present the committee on evaluating apprenticeships for their addition to the master credential list. So Dan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, members of the committee. I think what a riveting discussion, and ultimately the work of this Credentials Review Committee is a very tangible kind of component or piece of what the REACH Act was doing, which is to align the education and business communities, right? The needs of business and the offerings in education. So really excited for that discussion we just had. And this next topic is in line with that as well. As many of you know, registered apprenticeships are one of the credential types that are included on the master credentials list. Registered apprenticeships are also a very unique credential type, as a formal registered apprenticeship combines both on-the-job training with related technical instruction, and it results in a recognized and portable credential that the individual can take with them. Additional unique elements of a registered apprenticeship are that apprenticeships require an employer in order to be registered. And each registered apprenticeship also includes a documented wage schedule, or a progression that determines how much an apprentice will be paid as different milestones throughout the registered apprenticeship program are met. So these unique characteristics kind of forced a deeper analysis and, frankly, a different perspective on how we would accept and evaluate applications for apprenticeships seeking inclusion on the master credentials list. If we go to the next slide, Nathan, the current master credentials list currently has 522 registered apprenticeships included. 437 of those apprenticeships fully meet the demand and wage thresholds of the framework of quality and are on full approval. But then we've got a handful of apprenticeships that are on provisional status. So we have 45 apprenticeships that did not meet the demand criteria, and we have 14 apprenticeships that do not meet the wage criteria, and 26 apprenticeships that don't meet either both demand and wage. But because of the unique characteristics of apprenticeship, we're contemplating revising how we review these unique credentials against the framework of quality. So if you'll go to the next slide, I'd like to share with the committee what we're contemplating. So what we're contemplating on the demand side, and all of these, just for to level set, these are all non-degree credentials, so they do need to meet both demand and wage criteria. But registered apprenticeships would meet demand if they meet the framework of quality, just like every apprenticeship, or capitalizing on the unique characteristic of an apprenticeship that an employer is involved in the registration of the apprenticeship, kind of essentially, saying that, yes, this is in demand. An employer is setting this up and saying this is in demand. What we're contemplating revising here is that a registered apprenticeship would meet local demand if it is a newly registered apprenticeship program in the last academic year, or if it has at least one registered apprenticeship in the last academic year. So again, showing that there's been a registered apprenticeship, and then alternatively, if it's a brand new program, giving them time to, to register an actual apprentice for the program. Or if none of those things are true, the normal process of submitting an application for local demand and passing that evaluation would apply. On the wage side, the current wage threshold that we utilize is, does the occupation that's linked to the credential, does it meet kind of aggregate wage calculations for the occupation overall as provided by the Labor Market Estimating Conference? But because one of the unique characteristics of an apprenticeship is that there's a very specific and defined wage schedule inherent in the program itself, we could use that wage to show that, yes, this program meets the wage criteria that we've established. So rather than rely on the aggregate wage calculations for this very specific program, which we know pays, X amount, if that amount is higher than the wage criteria we've set, we would use that. So next slide, Nathan. So these changes that we were contemplating, if enacted, if we were to do this, you could see we have a total of 85 registered apprenticeships that are on the list today in a provisional status. The 45 that are provisional for demand, another 35 would be fully approved. On the wage side, 13 of the 14 that are provisional for wage currently would be fully approved. And 8 of the ones that are provisional for both would be fully approved, leaving us, moving kind of from a delta standpoint from 85 currently provisional registered apprenticeships to a total of only 29. So I think what this essentially would do, we change our evaluation this way, is provide a quicker on-road for apprenticeships through the registration process, and allow them to be, on the master credentials list, leveraging their unique characteristics to meet the local demand and the wage thresholds. You can go to the next slide, please, Nathan. Implementation of this change in evaluation really would require simply revisions to the technical assistance documents that we have on the website. It would also precipitate us putting forward an automatic evaluation as new apprenticeships are registered. So currently in the state of Florida, a program does not become a registered apprenticeship program until it goes into the registered rather at the Department of Education. So it's a very formal process that's very structured and standardized. What we would like to do here is once a program once a registered apprenticeship program is registered with the state of Florida, we would automatically evaluate that against the framework of quality, given the criteria we've established, thus reducing any administrative burden for those apprenticeships to also apply on the master credentials list. So with that, Madam Chair, I would, love to hear the comments from the committee, or if there are any kind of additional kind of considerations that we should think about as we, look to move forward with this change in evaluation. So it's not a change to the framework of quality. We're not looking for a board vote, but we are looking for committee, input and in what we're contemplating. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, are there any questions for Dan on the evaluation of apprenticeships?
Actually, I have one, Madam Chairman.
Yep.
Is there perhaps Dan could go through again with me, maybe in something that I would understand a little bit better. What I worry about are instances as we have now, where, let's say, again, out of the semiconductor industry, we're looking for new approaches, and perhaps an apprenticeship is a very reasonable discussion. The thing that I'm worried about at this point is that the demand right now for semiconductor, even though there's I think a governmental push to reshore all of these. Unfortunately, the semiconductor industry is relatively regional, and Florida at one point was actually quite high on the list of areas that would employ people in semiconductors. Right now, I'm not sure where that is, but we're certainly not Phoenix or the Silicon Valley. So how would an apprenticeship in, say, semiconductor technician level of training be supported by the local demand criteria of the apprenticeship currently in the state, even after your adjustment that you just described?
Yeah, I think that's the perfect example. So one of the things that's great about a registered apprenticeship program is it allows for a very quick way for a credential to be created and registered in the state of Florida as an official thing. So the company needs to be involved in that process and establishing, here are the standards, here are the skills that are going to be trained, both through on-the-job training and through some related technical instruction that might be from a local education partner, so maybe a K-12 or district technical college or Florida college system or some other educational partner providing that instruction alongside the company itself. So by virtue of registering the apprenticeship, the company is saying, I'm in demand of this thing, and I will hire apprentices. I will bring on apprentices to be part of this program. So they are now employees of the organization, employees of the company, and earning a wage, right, as they progress along this training plan. So I think that the nature of an apprenticeship program, as it just in its current form, is one that expresses the demand by the employer, and it also, because it has very specific wages defined with the apprenticeship, the employer is saying, this is what I will hire this individual at. And when they meet these 10 skills or show competency on these 10 skills, I'll raise their salary to this amount, and then 10 more skills or whatever that schedule is, to the point that they've completed all of the skills for, in this example, the semiconductor technician program. So inherent in the type of credential that it is, you have kind of a built-in wage and you have a built-in demand because of the strong link to the employer. So I think for those reasons, that's why we're saying, hey, we'd like to change the way we apprenticeship and say, by nature of its existence, it meets demand, or by virtue of local demand. And by virtue of its wage schedule, we can assess that wage against the thresholds itself, rather than say, oh, you don't link to a specific SOC code that's there today because the industry is emerging so fast, right? But I can show you on this apprenticeship program that these are the wages that the person will be making. Let's assess it against that. Does that answer the question, Dr. Constantine?
I think so. I actually like this. So as you were speaking, it just dawned on me. So this is what you were describing as local demand, meaning that
Yes.
all you need is a single group, and that would be enough to generate the local demand so that the apprenticeship could be included on the credentials list. Is that fair? Okay. Now,
That's an accurate assessment. Yes.
so in order to do that, though, the corporation that is sponsoring this apprenticeship would still need to partner, I would imagine, as you're describing, with one of the local education outlets, either a state college or as you're saying, perhaps even K through 12. And so let's say it's a group that I'm associated with, we would have to somehow create a curriculum. Is that kind of how that works? And then, see who would be interested in actually teaching this curriculum, or I'm still not sure as to how, it's something that isn't well, for me at least, I don't quite get it. Where do we start?
And we can bring, with the chair's direction, some additional information on apprenticeships, but essentially an apprenticeship is a partnership with an education entity and a business to create what that learning program will look like. And it's a combination of traditional learning and on-the-job training, where the candidate, the apprentice or the student, if you want to look at it that way, is getting paid while learning.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the key part of a registered apprenticeship is that it does end in and culminate in a recognized credential that is portable.
Okay, thank you.
Very good.
And Dan, just a point of clarification. If they are a registered apprenticeship, we as a committee are evaluating them. Or do they also need to come through? Do they need to come through a local board?
No, I think what we're suggesting here is, what we're suggesting here as well is we would automatically evaluate any new apprenticeship as it's registered. And once you're on the list, we do a reevaluation on an ongoing basis, just as we did when the new labor market data comes out. So for a business, say, who is sponsoring an apprenticeship, they wouldn't have to register with the Department of Education and to have the apprenticeship, and then turn around and submit an application for inclusion on the master credentials list. We would try to, the second bullet here is we want to do is make that a seamless process, so it's one and the same. Once you've provided all your information to be registered, we already know all we need to know to evaluate you against the framework of quality. Again, avoiding unnecessary delays to inclusion on the master credentials list, getting to the more real-time dynamic nature of this list that we can get to, the better.
Great. Are there any other questions for Dan? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
So as members of the committee know, CareerSource Florida hosts an application on its website for eligible submitters to provide information about credentials. The joint review team receives applications and applies the approved framework of quality established by the committee to all credentials received. The latest quarterly window for credential submission closed on September 30th. At this time, it's my pleasure to recognize Jackie Barreros, Senior Program Analyst with CareerSource Florida's Workforce Program Development Team, to provide a summary of applications received. Jackie, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. As a reminder, the Master Credentials List online application is open year-round for Florida school districts, Florida college system institutions, and local workforce development boards to submit credentials for the Master Credentials List. On a quarterly basis, CareerSource Florida downloads the applications submitted by the quarterly due date and coordinates the review of those credentials by an interagency evaluation team made up of subject matter experts from the Florida Department of Education, Florida Commerce, and CareerSource Florida. The application deadlines for quarterly review are typically in March, June, September, and December. And the latest application deadline, as mentioned previously, was September 30th. The September deadline is unique in that it is also the annual deadline for the Career and Professional Education, or CAPE Act, for the upcoming academic year. Next slide, please, Nathan. Today, we're providing a breakdown of the applications received during this application cycle. From July 1st through September 30th, a total of 37 credentials were submitted for consideration for the Master Credentials List. 35 of them were received through the Master Credentials List online application on the CareerSource Florida website. And 2 of them were received by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services through the process outlined by the department at the last Credentials Review Committee meeting. In the agenda packet for this meeting, you'll find a list of all the credentials for which an application was received during this application cycle. All of these credentials are industry certifications, and 27 of them are seeking CAPE funding eligibility. 14 of them are seeking secondary CAPE funding, and 6 of them are seeking post-secondary CAPE funding. Since the September 30th deadline, the interagency review team has been evaluating these credentials against the framework of quality, and the Department of Education is also reviewing the industry certifications that are seeking CAPE funding. At your next meeting in February, the credentials that meet the criteria within the framework of quality will be presented for your consideration to be included in the 2024-2025 Master Credentials List. This concludes my update, and thank you for the opportunity to present. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions for Jackie? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Jackie. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we're now at the open discussion portion of our meeting. Do any of our committee members have a discussion item that they would like to bring forward? Are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
There are no public comments.
Okay, thank you. So before we conclude today, I'd like to share a high-level summary of next steps for this committee. We'll continue to work closely with our partners at Florida Commerce and Department of Education to evaluate the applications that are submitted by the end of the calendar year 2023. The CareerSource Florida team will continue to provide support for applicants who need assistance. And our next meeting is scheduled for February 21st in Tallahassee. At this meeting, we will receive an update on the applications received and vote on the credentials to be included in the 2024-2025 Master Credentials List. I encourage stakeholders to regularly visit the Credentials Review Committee's website under the boardroom link at careersourceflorida.com. This is where information about upcoming meetings, meeting agendas, and the Master Credential List and application are available. Feel free to contact the CareerSource Florida team with any questions. Congratulations again to committee members Bob Boyd and Kevin Carr. You're truly deserving of the recognition of Florida Trend, and we are certainly grateful for your contributions to the committee. I want to thank all the presenters, moderators, and panelists again for their time, talent, and encouragement to help inform the committee and the important education and workforce developments of the state. Today, we took another step towards another step forward for the Credentials Review Committee. I think sometimes we might not understand the huge amount of work that it takes for these credentials to be evaluated and to make it onto the Master Credential List. I just want to draw attention to the members of this committee and to the public listening. Today, the president and CEO, Adrian Johnston of CareerSource Florida, presented to the House Post-Secondary Education and Workforce Committee on the work of CareerSource Florida and specifically the work of the Credentials Review Committee. And she did, I think, a great job of laying out the tremendous amount of work that this committee has undertaken over the past 2 years. So I would encourage anyone to go back and watch that presentation to just kind of understand the breadth of what has happened over the past 2 years. So I appreciate everybody, my colleagues on this committee and our support staff at CareerSource Florida for all of their work. And look forward to seeing everyone in Tallahassee in February. I'm sure CareerSource Florida's team will be reaching out to members with more details as they come. Just a reminder, the Credentials Review Committee's work is vital to helping our state reach the governor's goal that Florida will be #1 in the nation for workforce education. And I believe we're moving closer and closer to that goal every day. So with that, we wish everyone a safe and enjoyable holiday as we close out 2023. And our meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone.